Okay, so welcome back from the weekend, guys. So we're kind of in the final stretch here. We're entering our last unit, which is homeostasis. So this is my favorite unit. This is what I primarily focused on when I did my undergrad. So I did my undergrad in medical sciences and focused on physiology and pharmacology. And it really kind of focused on this idea of homeostasis. So definitely my favorite unit, and today we're going to kind of enter into my favorite topic on that unit, which is the nervous system. So I did my master's in neurogenetics, which was also kind of related to physiology, and basically the kind of combination of genetics and neurology. So really one of my favorite topics. So really the kind of idea of homeostasis and what Unit 4 really is about is maintaining the body within a specific set of parameters. It's basically making sure that the body doesn't go out of whack, making sure you don't become too hot, that you don't become too cold. Really, the idea comes down to making sure that cellular respiration keeps running. And it keeps running effectively, and making sure that the body doesn't become too hot so it can't perform the reaction, making sure that you always have the proper amount of glucose in your blood, making sure that you have enough water in your body, making sure you have enough oxygen in your body, making sure that you're moving in the proper direction. All of that comes down to homeostasis. Okay, so the idea behind homeostasis is just maintaining a balanced and an unbalanced world. So as we go through the world, so as we go through the world, the outside world's always kind of changing. We have hot days, we have cold days, it starts raining, it starts snowing, and throughout all those activities, so a couple of pictures I have here, say you're exercising, you're out in the rain, you go swimming, you're out just sitting relaxing, or even here in Canada, we get super cold, we drop, say, -10. Now, in all these different activities, our body temperature can't change more than just a few degrees. Okay, so 5 degrees either way before problems start happening. And we've already kind of talked about going hotter is a lot worse than going colder. But getting up to, 40 degrees Celsius, your body temperature, and you're going to start having some serious problems. And then once you get up to 43, 44, you're now close to death, if possibly even dying. So, you really can't get this body temperature too out of whack, even though we're doing all these different things. We're jumping into cold water. We're going out into the cold. We're walking in rain. So all of these activities keep going on in the outside world, but we have to make sure that inside our body, nothing really changes. Okay, and that's what homeostasis is all about. How do we do that? How do we make sure nothing changes inside? So the human body must maintain a number of strict parameters in the internal environment. There's a number of different things that our body has to make sure stays within a certain range in order to operate properly. So one of them is body temperature. Okay, all of the reactions in our body, and primarily cellular respiration, require the body temperature of 36.5. Okay, so that's why all of us are around 36.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, it's because the enzymes that are inside our body that control cellular respiration work perfectly at that temperature. If they go too hot, then you start basically denaturing the enzyme or denaturing a protein, and then we can't perform cellular respiration. And so it's very important that we have that set body temperature because all of our enzymes work on that temperature. Another set parameter is our blood pH, so how acidic or basic our blood is, and that comes down to the same reason. If you remember from our first unit, you can deactivate enzymes with pH off. So if our blood becomes really basic or becomes really acidic, then our enzymes stop working because they only work in a certain pH range. Okay, and that's basically just slightly basic, so our blood's just slightly basic. Blood glucose. So we have to make sure that, again, for cellular respiration, that you always have a certain amount of glucose in your bloodstream so that when cells start using up that glucose, the bloodstream's right there to provide it with them. So we have to make sure that we have a set glucose. You can't have too much, because if you have too much sugar in your blood, it thickens your blood and it makes it really thick. So imagine if you dissolved a whole bunch of sugar into water. It gets super thick, and your heart has a difficulty pumping around this almost like a molasses. Okay, and that's really what molasses is. It's just water with a whole bunch of sugar dissolved in it. Okay, so you can't have it too thick, and you also can't have it too low. Blood osmolarity, so that's really kind of how much water is in there. So your body has to make sure that there's enough water in there to be dissolving all these different things. You have to have proper testosterone and estrogen levels, so these comes down to hormones. And these are just a few examples. There's a whole bunch of other set points in our body that our body has to maintain. And homeostasis is all about, well, how does it do that? How does it make sure our body temperature doesn't fly off or spike? Same with pH and blood glucose, because if we do, it usually leads to death. So that kind of leads into homeostasis, is the study of how the body maintains a constant internal environment despite changes to the external or internal environment. And what I mean by that is most of it's going to be external, like adjusting to the outside world, but sometimes we bring things in, like if we eat. Okay, if we eat something, or if we drink something, say you drink a cold glass of water, well, now you just brought in a whole bunch of cold water into your body. So your body's going to have to make an adjustment and make sure that that cold water doesn't drop your body temperature down to 32 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's what I mean by internal. Sometimes we bring things into our body that we have to make adjustments. Medications, drugs, all those kind of things are other examples of internals. So how does the body do it? Okay, how does the body make sure that we don't go out of whack? Well, the body maintains a constant internal environment by relying on, what we're going to talk about today, the brain, the central nervous system, and then all the organs. So the organs all have basically a role in ensuring that cellular respiration keeps going. And the brain and the central nervous system is really kind of just the project manager of all the organs. So each organ plays a role in maintaining the internal balance. Like the liver has a job, the pancreas has a job, the lungs have a job. Every different organ in your body all have certain roles. And who's coordinating all those roles is what we call the brain and the nervous system, and that's really kind of just a project manager. It's really just making sure that all of those organs are doing their job and allowing the organs to communicate with each other. That's really what the brain and the nervous system does. It doesn't actually kind of provide its own function other than just making sure all the other organs are doing their job. Okay? You can kind of think of organs as little mini brains, and the project or the actual brain or central nervous system as the master brain. Okay, you see this kind of scenario as well in business. Okay, you think of, you have a whole bunch of employees, and then you have a manager that basically just makes sure that all those employees are doing their job. That's really kind of their role. Well, that's really kind of what the brain is really just making sure all the organs are doing their job. Okay, so we're going to go through kind of just the basics, homeostasis, the basics. So we've already kind of gone through this before, but basically kind of we're working our way up now. We talked about atoms originally, and then macromolecules. Macromolecules build cells, and then cells, are kind of come together. And we're actually going to be kind of talking about organs and organ systems right now today. Okay, I don't want to spend too much on this lecture. I'm also not going to spend too much time on this, so this is just all some different organ systems that we have in our body. If you've ever wondered, what are the different organ systems, especially for those thinking going on in, say, medicine, it's good to know some of the different organ systems that are required. And again, all of these just have a role in maintaining cellular respiration. They do it either directly or indirectly, make sure that cellular respiration runs. All right, I've already gone through this kind of scenario of, if you go out in really, really hot or if you go out in really, really cold areas, the differences between the two. Okay, so the basics of the nervous system. All right, so the nervous system is really kind of broken down into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So that's the two main components. Now, the central nervous system is... Okay, so they're really kind of broken up into the two. The central nervous system is really just the brain and the spinal cord. So those are the only two parts. And then the peripheral nervous system are all your nerves that run off of your spinal cord. So the nerves running down your limbs and running down your body. Okay, so those are the two main parts. And we're going to kind of break them up into two kind of sections. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated than this, okay? Because when we kind of look at the overall nervous system, okay, we have the CNS, the central nervous system, which I just talked about, the spine and the brain, of course. And then the peripheral nervous system, those are all your nerves running out. And it kind of gets broken down into a couple different things. Within our nerves going out into our limbs, into the different bodies, we have some nerves that are somatic and other nerves that are autonomic. Okay? Now, I'll go through what that means. Now, within the autonomic, you also have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, when things get really confusing like this is why they use these flow charts, is to try and kind of organize things. There's the same idea between or along the ideas of a concept map, is you look at all this thing and it's very, very confusing at first, but as we go through it, this chart is going to be really, really handy and kind of outlining, well, how does everything break down? Okay, very handy. So we're in the peripheral nervous system. And then our next slide is going to talk about how there's two different types of those peripheral nervous system, the autonomic and the somatic. All right, so we're going to kind of start with the central nervous system, okay, the brain and the spinal cord only. So it's really just this, I'm going to highlight this kind of in red here. We've got the brain, and then just the spinal cord, okay? Not all these nerves coming out, but just the brain and the spinal cord. Now, there's really kind of, the main purpose of this is just to receive sensory information from the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So the purpose of the brain and the spinal cord is basically, I'm going to highlight this and say green, is it receives sensory information from your eyeballs. Okay? It receives sensory information from your hand and the skin. Okay? It receives sensory information from your taste buds. Okay? Now, our primary sense is sight. So our sight dominates over all of our other senses. Okay? If you have conflicting information being sent to the brain, one from your eyeballs and one from your ears, your brain always trusts your eyes. Okay? As our eyes are our dominant sense. So really kind of what the central nervous system is to receive all these senses, okay? All these information from the outside world or from the inside world in their body. And then once they get that information, I haven't changed my highlighter, the next part is they have to send information back out. So they get the information in, and then I'll kind of highlight here in yellow, then they send information back out. And they might say, oh, there's a ball coming. They receive that information, so your eyes sent that information that there's a ball coming towards your face, and now the brain's gonna say, okay, now I have to send a message to my arm to put my arm up and block that ball, okay? So really what we kind of think of the central nervous system as the control center, because it really receives information, thinks about a response, and then sends that back out. Okay? It's really kind of the actual thinking part, the formation of what you're going to chart. Okay. Now, the peripheral nervous system, okay, is a lot different. The peripheral nervous system are where all the sensors and what we call effectors are. They're the nerves running from the peripheral part of the body, from the CNS to the peripheral. So there are all these nerves right here. Okay? Everything I'm kind of highlighting in yellow is the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Everything that's not the spinal cord and the brain. So all of these nerves basically either send sensory information, so it's like a touch receptor in your fingers that would send that information to your spinal cord and then to your brain. And then you'd also have nerves that basically go from your brain to your spinal cord and then out to your arm for whether that's movement or out to your heart for increased heart rate, whatever. Right? So the peripheral nervous system is part of the sensing and affecting. The sensing is, again, kind of telling you what's going on, and then the affecting is your response to it. But like I mentioned before, it gets further divided into two different systems, the somatic and the autonomic. What I'm talking about here. Let's go back. So we're going to be talking about all these different nerves and the two different types. I'm going to go back to that chart to just kind of clarify. First one we're going to talk about is called the peripheral somatic. So these are all the nerves that are under voluntary control, that you're controlling with your brain. It's things that you want to do. So it consists of sensory receptors in the head and the extremities, because you control those. You kind of control, well, where am I going to look? What am I going to listen to? What kind of information am I going to receive? And moving your body parts. Okay, your arms and legs don't usually move automatically. They move under your voluntary control unless you have some kind of condition. So those are kind of under our, what we call our peripheral somatic nervous system. The somatic part is the key word, basically saying it's voluntary. So this is responsible for sending sensory information to the CNS and then responding to instructions from the CNS. And you can kind of replace CNS with brain and spinal cord. Okay? So these nerves are responsible for voluntary input of sensory information and voluntary effectors. So voluntarily moving your arm, voluntarily looking at something. And that's the key thing, under voluntary control. You're controlling it. So if you move your finger right now, okay, that action came from your brain, your CNS, to your finger muscle via a somatic nervous system, because you're voluntarily controlling that. You decided that you want to move it, and you moved it. Okay, that's what we call the somatic. Now, we also have the next one. Okay, we just covered somatic. Now we're going to talk about autonomic. What about the autonomic? The autonomic is a lot more complicated. It's all the ones that we don't control at all. It's basically what our kind of brain and spinal cord does all these jobs that we don't even really have to think about. They just do them for us. So it controls all non-voluntary secretions of hormones and contractions of muscles. So that's kind of things like, think about, when it gets dark outside, you don't have to actively think, okay, I need to increase the size of my pupil so I can see better. It just automatically happens. Okay, your brain just takes care of that for you. Or if you're exercising, you don't have to voluntarily think, okay, I need to start breathing heavier Right? Your brain just takes care of that for you and starts breathing heavier. You don't have to say to your body, okay, I want to increase my heart rate. It just does that for you. You don't have to tell your body when to turn your stomach on and turn your stomach off. You don't have to tell your body when to secrete pepsin or to control your saliva. You don't have to do that. It's all taken care of for you. And that's what we call the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Now, within all of those involuntary controls, okay, when the brain and spinal cord is doing all these actions for you, there's really two ways that they do it. They either do it using the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? And these two systems are opposite to each other. Okay? So one does one thing and one does the exact opposite. So what the parasympathetic does is basically non-voluntary control taken by your brain and your spinal cord to basically what we call sit and digest, or it's basically your relaxation. Okay, so when you want to relax or you want to go to sleep, you need your parasympathetic involuntary control activated. So your body automatically recognizes, okay, this person's tired. I'm going to now activate this parasympathetic, which is going to really relax this person. And do that, we're going to, it's called the sit and digest. So we're going to stimulate the flow of saliva. Okay, it allows you to eat, because when you eat, you should be, it's basically very relaxed when you eat. If you notice after, say, a workout, when you've just been exercising, you don't have a lot of hunger right afterwards, it's because when you are active like that, it shuts this system down. You're a lot more hungry when you're relaxed. It's going to slow your heartbeat down. It's going to allow you to kind of, slow down. You need this to sleep as well. You're not breathing heavier, so it kind of constricts your bronchi, so it doesn't require as much oxygen, so it really kind of closes down some of the chambers in your lungs. It stimulates kind of digestion to get that done. It stimulates the release of bile, and it contracts your bladder. It kind of initiates kind of bowel movements and peeing. Okay, so this is kind of like your activation of, it's called sit and digest. Think about it: relaxing, sitting, and then digesting food. So this is what you need. Again, you need this thing to happen to relax. This is the key: is this system causes you to relax, and you need to do that. Right? Now, other times you need to be stressed out. You need to have stress in your life to function properly. Okay? And when you get stressed, this is what gets activated. You're sympathetic. And it does the exact opposite of sit and digest. This is called the fight or flight. So this kind of evolved from when we were kind of running away from animals. And this is where your body is preparing now to either fight someone or an animal or to run away. So it's going to completely alter everything. This is what happens during stress. You activate this system. That's going to dilate your pupils. It inhibits flow of saliva. You don't want to be digesting food right now. You're going to send all your energy to your muscles. So you shut down all basically digestion. It's going to increase your heart rate, because you're going to want more oxygen going to your cells. It's going to open up all of your lungs, which is dilation. It's going to stop digesting or peristalsis in your digestive system. It's going to convert a whole bunch of glycogen to glucose. So now you're going to get a whole blood rush of glucose, because those cells are going to start taking it. It's also going to release adrenaline and noradrenaline. So that's that kind of tingly feeling. If you've ever, say, had cops pull up behind you and they put their lights on, you get this kind of tingly feeling over top of you. You just got released by adrenaline because you were stressed. It inhibits your bladder contraction. Okay? This is kind of like your stress response. Right? It's also kind of, if you have, say, like anxiety, what anxiety actually is an overactivation of this. It means that you're not doing a very good job activating this, and you're constantly kind of stressed or on edge, and that's what kind of anxiety is. Okay. So we're going to kind of go through just some examples of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so this is things that are taken care of for us. Okay, and that's kind of things like breathing contractions, intestine contractions, heartbeat contractions, eyeball contractions. Now, the instructions are still coming from your brain. It's just you don't have to think of it. Okay. Now, I know I'm kind of jumping over here. I'm just kind of giving you some highlights of the nervous system. So inside our brain and inside all of our nerves, they're all made of these things called neurons, and that's what the cell looks like. It's a very odd-looking cell, but this whole thing that's yellow, it's all one cell. Right? It's called a neuron. It's a very weird-looking one. In there you can see that's the nucleus. So that's the main cell type that we have inside our brain, in our spinal cord, and in our neurons. The other thing they have is called these things called glial cells, and glial cells are these little blue things that you see here, and they're just there as basically maintaining the neurons. Okay, these neurons are not kind of like other cells that die, after a few days. They last a long period of time, and once they do die, they don't recover. They don't replicate very well, especially as we get older. Now, you can replicate them as when you're younger, but as you age, you stop in replication. So they actually have special cells that take care of them, okay, unlike any other cells in the body. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this but I do want you to know just kind of what a neuron looks like. So this is, again, the neuron. Okay, this is the cells of the brain. It's this long blue thing. This end here is called the dendrite, and that's where it kind of receiving all the sensory information. So like all these little branches are receiving sensory information. Then they send that sensory information all the way down to what we call the axon, and that's where it kind of either touches a muscle and causes a muscle to move, or it would just transfer that information to another neuron. Okay, I know this is a little confusing, but don't worry too much about this, because we're just really kind of highlighting the basics of the nervous system. Okay, I'm next going to go into just a little bit more on the CNS. So again, it's composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Its purpose is the control center. Okay, there is also some sensors inside the brain, but mostly it's just a control center. Now, the result of the damage is variable. Okay, it's not like when we talk about the peripheral. When you get damage into your brain or your spinal cord, it really depends on the location of the damage, because it can cause a variety of symptoms. It may cause you to not be able to walk anymore, it may not be able to talk anymore, or to be able to see, or to be able to hear, or to be able to taste things. Okay? The result is really, really variable. You have no idea, or it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen when somebody gets a brain or spinal cord injury. Okay? Because one of the things that also happens is, because your brain is really kind of controlling your personality, you can see personality changes where someone can, after a brain injury or after a stroke or after an aneurysm, have quite significant changes in their personality. Okay, now I'm going to again lightly touch on this. This is just the idea of, you may have heard of gray and white matter before. So inside our brain, okay, so this is our brain. This is kind of a cross-section of it down here. Okay, we have areas of gray matter and we have areas of white matter. And the difference is that basically what we consider white matter are the parts of the brain that need really, really fast responses. So if you are in white matter, that means that the communication between the neurons has got to be super fast. So it's for very important processes. Okay, it would be for very important things like seeing, being able to control heart rate, being able to control temperature, really, really fast responses. Okay? Gray matter is where the response has to be quick, because you're still using the nervous system, but not as quick. Okay? So they're kind of mostly located on the outside of the brain, okay, in areas that aren't as important. Now, everything in the brain is important, but the outside of the brain, which is less protected, doesn't contain as important processes as the inside of the brain. Okay? And so if you damage that outside, and you damage it all the time, especially if any of you have had a concussion, that's what you've done, is basically you've smashed your brain up against your skull, and you've damaged the outside. And you've kind of damaged your gray matter, or hopefully only just your gray matter. And that's for less important processes. Okay? The inside part is the more important process. Here's just a better example of it. So here's all your gray matter, and the inside is your white matter. Okay, so we're going to start with the spinal cord. The spinal cord connects to the brain, to the peripheral nervous system. So all your nerves in your hands, they don't go directly into your brain, they go into your spinal cord and then into your brain. So within the spinal cord, there's sensory nerves, the PNS, peripheral nervous system, carry messages from the body to the brain for interpretation. The spinal cord was our original brain. In really kind of simple animals, like say a jellyfish doesn't even have a brain, it just has a really kind of a simplistic spinal cord. That was our original brain, and then as we evolved and advanced, we developed a more complicated brain at the top. So really the spinal cord now connects our main brain to our peripheral. There's a hole in the back of your skull, and if you remember, we did dissections of fetal pigs. Some of us dissected out brains. So at the very back of your skull, you have basically a hole. Everybody does, and that's where your spinal cord goes in. So you're going to actually have a little hole in your skull, and your spinal cord is going to run into there and then connects into your brain. So here's an example of your spinal cord. And they break it up into 4 sections, okay, called the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And really, this is a very, very kind of important 4 sections because they really kind of break them up, and they call each of these little bones vertebrae, and they're covering around a very, very important nerve that runs all the way up and down your body. Okay, so you have, let me just kind of draw this here. You have a nerve, okay, that runs all the way through into your spinal cord, and this main nerve, which I'm going to draw really thick, goes through your spinal cord, and then you have all these nerves coming out of it. Okay. Well, this main nerve, it's very important not to get severed, because if you sever this main nerve, you're going to lose a lot of capabilities. So when they look at your spinal cord, they break it down into vertebrae, and they call this C1 because it's C for cervical, and that's the first vertebrae, second, third, fourth, so there's 8 in the cervical, then there's 12 in the thoracic, and then 5 in the lumbar, and then 5 in the sacral. Now, when you get into an accident or you get into an injury, what they're really concerned with is doctors want to know is basically where did you sever this main nerve that I'm kind of drawing here in black. Because say you severed it and they say, oh, it was between the T8 and T7. Okay, so say you severed it right there, T8 and T7. Now they're going to know, well, what capabilities you're going to lose, because now you're going to lose all of these. Okay, you now can't get communication down this part of your spinal cord anymore. So now you won't be able to move your abdomen. Okay, now you're not going to be able to move your leg muscles. You're not going to be able to control bowel movements or bladder. Okay, you've lost all of those abilities. You can still move your chest, so you'll be able to breathe fine. You can be able to move your head, your diaphragms, so you'll be able to breathe fine. Your biceps, your wrists, your triceps, your hands, all of those are good. Now, the worst case scenario is if you severed, say, up here. Okay, and this is when you become like a quadriplegic. This would be the worst case scenario. You have a sever between like the C1, C2 vertebrae or a C2, C3, because now if you sever there, you've lost all of these capabilities. So now you can't control any of these things. And it all comes down to severing this very important nerve that comes down. And that's why we have a spinal cord. That's why we have these bones. And that's what vertebrates are. It's just basically a protection for this nerve. Okay. I've already gone through kind of how I wanted in that lecture. So now we'll talk about the brain. So if you are able to log on to that link that I sent you, it's a pretty kind of neat. It kind of breaks down all the different parts of the brain. So we don't really have time to go through it, but basically the brain is segmented into all these different little parts, and everybody's parts are the same. So, this area does a certain thing, this area does a certain thing, this area does a certain thing. That's why when we get damaged, so if you get damage to the front part of your brain, everybody has the same symptoms. If you get damage to the back part of your brain, the same symptoms. If you get damage to right here, so right here is called your cerebellum. If you get damaged right there, everybody's going to have the same problems. They're going to have difficulty with coordination. Okay, so the brain doesn't just kind of do functions everywhere. They actually have little different departments inside your brain. Okay, we don't need to talk about the blood-brain barrier. So, continuing on with the brain is actually segmented into 2 halves. Okay, the 2 cerebellums, the left and right cerebellum. Okay, or also called the left and right cortex. So the outside edge is called the cerebral cortex. Okay. And they really kind of do 2 different functioning. So the right side of your body is actually controlled by the left side of your brain. Right? I know it's odd, but that's the way that it works. And the right side of your brain actually controls the left side of your body. Okay? Now, along with actually controlling opposite sides, so just before we move on, so if you have a stroke in the right side of your brain, the symptoms you would present is the left side of your body would lose function, and you have a slopey left side. And if you had a stroke in the left side of your brain, your right side would lose sensation. Okay? And that's what I'm talking about, kind of motor function. Now, along with motor function differencing, there's also kind of differences in the 2 parts of the cerebral cortex, the left and the right. They do different kind of functioning. And people often say, well, one is more developed than others. I'm a left-sided brain person or I'm a right-sided brain person. Well, that's not necessarily true, okay? You don't have a bigger left side or a bigger right side. But you may have inherited genetics that makes you more interested in, say, things that are on the left side or compared to things that are on the right side. So the right side are more kind of what we call creative people or artistic people. The people that are very, very creative, they think kind of outside the box. They're usually people with lower anxiety. They're usually kind of the free thinkers, socialist kind of people. The left side is more of the math people, the science people, the logic people, the people that kind of like clear sets of directions. They like structure, they like organization. And oftentimes, you can kind of classify yourself, well, I'm left or I'm right. But there is some unique people that are kind of both. Okay? I know I'm not. I'm definitely a left-sided person. But, there are some people that have both. Okay, you've probably seen this before, maybe in one of Lanson's class called the Stroop effect. So if you try and make both parts of your brain try and work at the same time, they'll give conflicting signals. So there's one part of your brain, one side of your brain controls color, and the other side controls language or reading or words. So what happens if you look at something and you try and activate both sides of the brain? Well, they're going to send both messages in, and your brain has to decide, well, which message am I going to receive? So what I'd like you to do in class is if you look at these, I'd like you to read out, what you're seeing here, right? And read out what you're seeing here, and read out what you're seeing here. Now, some of us may say, okay, when I read this, I read purple, but some of us may have said red. And you look here, and you say blue, okay, even though it says yellow. And the reason for that is you're getting the color blue is coming in, but the word yellow is coming in, and your brain has to make a decision, well, which signal do I listen to? Which part of the brain should I allow to dominate over the other part? And we differ in this. Okay? Some people will have one part of their brain and will say, oh, this just said green to me. Okay? When I read it, I see red because I don't have that other part of my brain being activated, or one part is dominating. Okay, so this is kind of just an interesting thing. We're kind of ending up on this lecture, so I'm just going to kind of show you an interesting thing. So the brain is the most energy-demanding organ in the body. It's the one that needs the most ATP. Right? So it must have a constant flow of oxygen and glucose in order to perform cellular respiration in order to make that ATP. Now, when supplies are low, so if you are losing oxygen or you're losing, say, glucose, your brain actually starts systematically shutting down non-essential systems, and it will leave your brain to last. If it's noticing that you don't have very much oxygen left in your body or very much glucose, then it basically says, okay, muscles, you're not getting any more glucose or oxygen. I'm taking all the reserves and I'm sending it to my brain. And it does that systematically where it kind of shuts down systems in order, looking at it and saying, oh my God, we have really low oxygen levels. I got to shut this down. Oh, they're even lower. Now I have to shut down this system. So it actually starts shutting down your body in different areas. So an example would be, say you are being asphyxiated, okay, or being strangled. Okay, that's just kind of a fancy word for saying strangled. So if you are now losing oxygen, okay, so now you have now blocked off your tube and you're not going to be getting oxygen anymore. Your brain will sense this and it will immediately detect the rapid loss of continuous oxygen flow. It notices that oxygen is not continuously flowing in. So that it'll basically send your body into a response. It will say, okay, I've noticed this. Let's start coughing because maybe there's something blocked. So your brain will automatically send that signal to your throat to begin a contraction and say, start coughing, right? If that doesn't work, it'll start telling your body, start gasping, okay? Diaphragm, start dropping, start making these sudden drops to try and pull in air because there's something potentially clogging it. If your brain notices this doesn't work, okay, that's its first attempt, then it starts going through, well, what's my backup? The body will then report to plan B and shut down non-essential parts of the body losing oxygen, and this includes all muscles and auditory parts. So this is when you will pass out. Your brain actually shuts you down. Your brain says, I don't have enough energy right now or oxygen to allow my eyes to run or to allow my ears to run or even my muscles to run, so I'm going to shut all those down. I'm not going to kill myself. I'm just going to shut them all down, and that's when you pass out. It's actually your brain making you pass out, okay, because they're basically shutting down all your systems. So it'll allow your heart to continue pushing. Okay, so once you pass out, your heart's still going, okay, because your brain's not going to shut that down. But only a few areas are active in the brain at that point as well. So you got your heart going, you got your brain going, but really most other things have now been shut down. Now, depending on how long the areas of the brain lack oxygen will determine the severity. So if we never get oxygen back in there, then eventually the brain will run out, and that will be clinical death, and you've died from asphyxiation. But if at some point the clog becomes unclogged in your throat, or you're able to get oxygen, or somebody gives you CPR, then you can restart that, and then your brain will start now reactivating all of your systems, and that's when you come out of, if you fainted or if you've passed out, that's when you come back to. Your body's now recognized, I now have enough oxygen, we can bring those systems back up. Okay, last slide. I know this was a long one, but I will keep the learning check short because I know that this was a longer slideshow. So the brain is the most energy-demanding organ in the body. It must have a constant flow of oxygen and glucose in order to maintain capabilities. When supplies are low, the brain will systematically start shutting down non-essential systems and leaving the brain to last. So another example, along with the asphyxiation, was starvation. Okay? So if your brain detects lower glucose levels, the brain will then decrease firing and the use of glucose in non-essential neurons. Again, it's going to start shutting down your muscles. So this will cause the brain to decrease its functioning and start making mistakes. It's not using glucose all the time. It's not using oxygen all the time. So this is why if you're really, really hungry or you haven't eaten, you sometimes will make some computing mistakes or not be able to think clearly. So when glucose levels are low, okay, the brain will cause the organism to behave in irregular ways, making uninformed decisions. That's why oftentimes they'll tell you to have a snack during an exam, or at least make sure that you're eating prior to going to school, because if you don't have glucose in your body, your brain actually can't even function properly. It needs it to function properly, and if it doesn't, it will make errors that you wouldn't normally make if you weren't as hungry. Okay. Now, this is also one of the reasons for decreased athletic performance, because as we perform, we start burning up all of our glucose, and as we run out of glucose, our brain starts running out of glucose, and that's why sometimes you'll see an athlete make a really, really dumb error, and it was really because their brain didn't have enough energy to make a smart decision. Okay, so I know this was a longer lecture, but I promise I'll keep the learning check short this week. Thanks for listening in.